There is a clock in the tower of the Church of Our Lady in Gdansk, Poland, that has been running since 1470. 550 years. Not continuously, it has been repaired, restored, reset. But the mechanism, the essential mechanism, has been in the same tower for over half a millennium. And if you stand in front of it and actually look at it, not photograph it, not glance at it while checking your phone, but actually look at what it is doing, what information it is displaying, something becomes very clear very quickly. This instrument was not built to tell time. It was built to model the cosmos. The Gdansk clock displays the current hour. It also displays the day of the week, the date of the month, the phase of the moon, the position of the sun and moon against the background of the zodiac, the times of sunrise and sunset for that specific day at that specific latitude, and the feast days of the liturgical calendar organized in relationship to the astronomical positions that govern them. 7 simultaneous streams of information, all running in parallel, all updated continuously, all based on the actual position of actual celestial bodies in the actual sky above Gdansk. I came to this investigation not through the clocks themselves, but through an absence. I was trying to understand why, in a period of roughly 50 years, between approximately 1840 and 1890, the tradition of astronomical clockmaking in Europe effectively ended. Not the tradition of clockmaking itself. Clockmaking flourished. Precision engineering advanced. The watches produced in Swiss and German workshops in the latter half of the 19th century were marvels of mechanical sophistication. But the specific tradition of the astronomical clock, the multifunction celestial instrument that had been installed in European city centers for over 400 years, simply stopped. No new great astronomical clocks were commissioned for public spaces after approximately 1880. The last of the great series, the third Strasbourg Cathedral clock, was completed in 1843. And after that, silence. The tradition died within a generation of the imposition of Greenwich Mean Time and railway standardization. And the official explanation for this is that the tradition became obsolete. That better, more accurate, more practical timekeeping methods superseded the need for these complex instruments. But here is what the official explanation doesn't address. The astronomical clocks were not replaced by better astronomical clocks. They were replaced by clocks that tracked only one thing: the passage of equal, standardized hours, a single stream of information instead of 7. And that reduction, that narrowing of what a public clock was expected to tell you, represents not an advance, but an enormous loss. Unless the information being lost was information that someone had decided you no longer needed. Let me take you through what was being lost, function by function. The astronomical clocks tracked lunar phase in real time, displayed visibly in the town square, legible to anyone who cared to look. Before standardized agriculture, before industrial food production, before the globalized food supply chain that insulates modern people from the rhythms of biological growth. The lunar cycle was operationally important, not mystically, practically. Planting, harvesting, the behavior of tide-dependent fisheries, the timing of certain biological processes in livestock and crops, all of these were understood by pre-industrial peoples as lunar correlated phenomena. The agricultural knowledge encoded in traditional almanacs was not superstition. It was observation, accumulated over generations, of what happened when you did things at certain phases of the moon, and what happened when you didn't. The astronomical clocks made this knowledge public, permanent, and impossible to forget. You could not walk through a medieval European city center without being reminded of where the moon was. You could not plan a week's activities without the lunar phase being part of your environmental context. The clocks enforced a kind of temporal literacy that included the moon as a fundamental reference point. When those clocks were superseded, when they became relics rather than instruments, that literacy began to erode. And within 2 generations, it was effectively gone. But the lunar function is just the beginning. The astronomical clocks also track the position of the sun against the zodiac, which is to say, they track the solar year with a specificity that the modern calendar, with its irregular months and arbitrary divisions, simply does not provide. They showed you, visibly, continuously, exactly how far through the year you were in astronomical terms. Not January 15th, which tells you almost nothing about where you are in the solar cycle relative to the solstices and equinoxes, but the sun in the 15th degree of Capricorn, which tells you precisely that you are 25 days past the winter solstice, moving toward the spring equinox at a calculable rate. This is navigational information. It is agricultural information. It is medical information. It tells you things about the current state of your biological environment that the modern date simply doesn't capture. The traditions that maintained this knowledge, that treated the astronomical position of the sun as essential operational information rather than decorative astronomy, were the same traditions that built the clocks. And they were the traditions that were most thoroughly disrupted in the period of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the period that corresponds to the cartographic erasure of Tartaria. The disruption was not violent. No, one came to take the astronomical clocks down. They were allowed to stand, and they stand still, as tourist attractions, as curiosities, as monuments to medieval quaintness. What was taken was not the instruments. What was taken was the institutional context that made the instruments necessary. The knowledge systems that had required this information, that had organized human activity around the lunar cycle and the solar year, were gradually replaced by systems that required only one thing: the standardized hour, the equal, universal, Greenwich-anchored unit of modern synchronization. Here is the pattern that I cannot stop thinking about. The great astronomical clocks were installed over a period of roughly 400 years. From the first surviving examples of the 13th century through the extraordinary flowering of the tradition in the 15th and 16th centuries, and the sustained continuation of the tradition through the 17th and 18th centuries. During this entire period, the territory that maps labeled as Tartaria was present on European cartography, consistently, confidently, with increasing interior detail. And the tradition of astronomical clockmaking flourished alongside the cartographic presence of Tartaria. Both traditions were operating simultaneously. Both assumed a relationship between human activity and celestial cycles as a practical, operational matter. Both understood time as a multidimensional phenomenon, layered, cyclical, tied to bodies larger than any government. And then, in the same decades, both disappeared. The cartographic presence of Tartaria dissolved from European maps between approximately 1770 and 1800. The tradition of astronomical clockmaking for public spaces produced its last great examples in the same window. The Strasbourg clock, completed in 1843, is in some ways a monument to the end of the tradition rather than a continuation of it. It was built explicitly as a restoration, as a replacement for an earlier clock that had stopped. It was a conscious act of preservation, not a natural continuation of a living practice. And 40 years after it was completed, the International Meridian Conference imposed Greenwich Mean Time on the entire planet. The tradition it represented was not just superseded. It was made categorically irrelevant by the new system's refusal to include the information it had been built to provide. I want to be specific about what the Strasbourg clock tells you that your phone doesn't. It tells you the position of the sun in the sky right now, at this moment, above the specific location of Strasbourg. It tells you the phase of the moon, not as an approximation, but as a calculated display accurate to within hours. It tells you the times of sunrise and sunset for today, recalculated daily. It shows you the movement of the planets against the background of the zodiac. It runs a perpetual calendar that will remain accurate for centuries without adjustment. It does all of this continuously, visibly, in a public space, legible to anyone who takes the time to learn to read it. Your phone tells you the time in your time zone. It tells you the date in the Gregorian calendar. And if you look up a weather app, it will show you a moon phase icon, probably inaccurate to within a day or two, because it's a cached image from a database rather than a calculated position. That is the entirety of the celestial information that the system that replaced the astronomical clocks decided you needed. One stream instead of 7. The hour instead of the cosmos. Why? The official explanation is efficiency, standardization, the rational demands of industrial coordination. And that explanation is not wrong. Exactly. Railway schedules do require uniform time. Factory shifts do require synchronized clocks. Modern logistics does require the kind of universal, location-independent time that Greenwich Mean Time provides. I accept all of that. What I cannot accept is that the replacement of the multifunction astronomical clock with the standardized hour clock was simply the natural result of industrial progress, with nothing lost in the transition. No knowledge abandoned, no orientation disrupted. Because something was lost. The people who stood in the squares of medieval and early modern European cities, who looked up at the astronomical clocks and read the lunar phase and the solar position and the time of sunset. Those people had a relationship with the sky that the people who check their phones for the time no longer have. They knew where they were in the year, in a biological, astronomical sense. They knew what the moon was doing. They knew how much daylight remained. They were oriented in the cosmos in a way that the standardized hour, the Greenwich-anchored railway-compatible, factory-optimized unit of modern time, simply does not provide. And the civilization that had built the instruments to provide that orientation, that had installed them in public squares across 4 centuries, in dozens of cities, that had treated celestial orientation as a civic responsibility, a public good, something to be displayed in the center of the city where everyone could see it. That civilization, or the knowledge tradition that sustained it, had a name in the centuries before 1800. It appeared on the maps. It had a geography. And then it disappeared. And the clocks that represented its approach to time, its understanding of what it meant to know where you were in the cosmos, were allowed to remain as decorative monuments to a past that the new system had no interest in continuing. I want to close with something specific. There are currently in Europe approximately 40 surviving astronomical clocks of the pre-industrial tradition. Some are still running. Many have been restored. A few are so damaged that only their outer casings remain, the internal mechanisms long since removed or collapsed. And of these, 40, precisely none, are in new buildings. They are all in structures built before 1850. They are all, without exception, in buildings that belong to the pre-reset era.